Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming today. This is an exciting opportunity for the strategic planning team. Many of the members here. How many SPT members are in the room? Yes, thank you so much for coming. And thank you to the rest of you for coming out today for what will be, I promise, a very exciting talk. Perhaps the words exciting and state demographer don't always go together, but for a historian, demographer is someone I'm very much interested in, because these are the folks who are like the wizard. They can look forward, like Gandalf from Tolkien's novel, right? They can kind of give you a sense for what is coming. And many of us in the room are aware of the fact that demographics-wise, it looks like maybe there's not a whole lot of good things coming. I'm looking at Michael, who has been telling us, there's the cliff coming in terms of college-age students. So I know that's foremost on many people's minds in the room today, and I feel very fortunate that we were able to have Elizabeth Garner, our state demographer, here. She's been the state demographer in Colorado for 15 years, and just in our brief conversation, I'm inclined to think we're going to learn a lot today. So thank you for joining us. Please, let's welcome Elizabeth Garner.
Well, thank you guys very much for having me as part of your program today. Before I go too far, I just want you guys to be aware that we're in the Department of Local Affairs. We're a state agency, and I want you to know that we're a resource that's available for all of you and anyone that you're working with, whether it's your classes, your students, in administration, whatever support we might be able to provide to you guys in terms of, I know some of you are like, yeah, fun demographics. Regardless, if you are, know that we're a resource that's available for you guys. And I have to tell you that this is the coolest screen I have ever presented at in my life. When I was having to reformat for this, I was like, are you sure it's this wide? And they're like, oh, yes, it is. So I've kind of played with it a little bit. So what I like to start with is some of the big takeaways that I'm hoping that you'll see as going through the presentation. One is that we have seen a lot of disparate growth within the state. And what does that mean? What does that mean to Metro, but what does that mean to the state as a whole? Migration. Sometimes I'll just ask the question, how many of you are not native Coloradoans? So when we curse those migrants, look at your friends and neighbors. But the big question is, how do you really, why do we get migration? And then when we think about the rationale behind it, how do we continue to attract and retain the right fit for all of the jobs in Colorado? Talk a little bit about aging, because that's a big issue in the state, and that is impacting our labor force, income, housing, jobs. Look at the increase in race and ethnic diversity within the state, because that's certainly impacting our youngins the most. Looking at a little bit of slowing income growth. Most of that is actually due to aging, so it's nothing traumatic, but it's in there as well. And then really kind of tied up with the fact that we are starting to see a lot of downward pressure on population growth, so definitely slowing, but still forecast to increase, and probably one of the fastest increases in the U.S. So how do you continue to plan for all of these people as they continue to migrate to the Colorado? Big picture, it's always important to remember that Colorado is part of the United States, right? It's like, I remember my geography class. Because whatever's happening to the U.S. will impact Colorado, and we can't forget that component. So for the U.S. as a whole, we increased this last year between 17 and 18 by a little over 2 million people, a 0.6 annual average growth rate, slowest growth rate in the United States since the Great Depressions in the 1930s. Can you believe that? Would you believe that? Do you believe it? First of all right, some people do believe, but it's really sometimes when you're in Colorado, and especially in the Denver metro area, hard to kind of believe it and feel it, because you feel all of this transition. We're ranked 7th fastest at 1.4, so quick math, twice as fast as the U.S. as a whole, behind some pretty fast-growing states. 8th in total growth at about 80,000, behind some pretty big states. Any Texans, former Texans, willing to admit a relationship to Texas at all? A couple of hesitant hands. What is that? Come on, be proud. When Texas grows, How much do you think they increase annually this last year between 17 and 18? We increased by 80,000. Come on, shout out a number. In total numbers, total thousands, don't go to a million, that's a little too fast. 300,000? Was it flat 300,000? That's really close. 350,000 is what they grow by annually this last year between 17 and 18. And we increased by 80,000, and we really do whine a lot about that, right? Imagine if you were Texas and had to manage that. Now, granted, they are a bigger state, but I think a lot when we talk about growth and we talk about how that feels, we need to really think it is not necessarily the people's fault. It's planning for the people that maybe we didn't do as great a job that we could have done. But within the state as a whole, we do have a range, some counties increasing, some counties declining. Since 2010, Colorado's increased by about 666,000, or about 83,000 a year, a 1.6 annual average growth rate. Denver, during that same time, between 2010 and 2017, increased by about a little over 100,000, 101,000, an annual average growth rate of about 2.2%. And if we look at the state as a whole, all of the red, orange, yellow counties are counties that have increased in population during this time. All of the shades of blue are counties that have declined. So this is what I mean about the disparity in growth within the state. We can see that it has been primarily concentrated along the I-25 corridor, the Front Range. About 95% of the growth has occurred there, compared to historical trends, which is closer to 83%. So we have seen this concentration of growth along the I-25 corridor, and the question would be, why? Why are we seeing this concentrated growth? Is it because of the types of jobs we're creating? Is it because of access to resources like broadband, or education, or healthcare, or daycare? Why are we seeing this compared to historical trends? So that's something just to keep in the back of your mind. So we can see between 2016 and 2017, Colorado or Denver increased by about 9,000. It was the third fastest and continues to be the largest county in the state at 705,000. If we look at total population change, there's two components. It's always important to understand the components in the population change. One is called natural increase, which is births minus deaths. And we can see how it's been over time. And we can see a couple of things in this graph. One, that we reached the peak in about 2007 and that it's been slowing down. So again, births minus deaths. So remember, this is a net number here is babies. These are babies. When we look at the red component, that's net migration, the ins minus the outs. And so we can see a couple of things as well. One time that we hit over 100,000 in the 1970s, and that was 5% annual growth rate. We can also see that we had 5 years of out-migration in the 80s. Love those 80s. That's when I was graduating from high school and college. It was such a great time to be here. Then we can see the 90s and into the early 2000s, we had 7 years above 100,000. But since 2001, we have not hit that 100,000 mark. We came really close in 2015, but we haven't been there. Yet, what do you hear the media say all the time? Unprecedented growth. Then I have to open up my handy-dandy dictionary to look up that word unprecedented. And I say, oh no, it's just short-term memory loss that you're suffering from. This is not unprecedented growth. This is totally precedented growth. This is totally what we had forecasted growth. There is nothing unusual about this whatsoever. Just so you know, people have had these numbers out there. So when they say unprecedented, it's not unprecedented whatsoever. But what I do want you to see is this decline in natural increase, and it's come from two different pieces. One, we've seen an increase in deaths, not because there's anything weird going on, no weird plague. It's just that there's a larger share of our population and age group that have higher death rates. So this is totally normal going on. At the same time, we're seeing a decline in births. Started in about 2007, driven a lot by the recession, because people are like, gosh, it's kind of expensive to have kids, so we've seen that downward pressure. So when we saw Toys R Us started to close up, should that have been any surprise whatsoever? No. Fewer births, and then we've got Amazon. both things giving pressure on retail. So this is kind of like one of those like, duh, you should have known. When we see this slowdown in births, I want to tell a couple of reasons behind it. It's huge. Decline in teen pregnancies. This chart looks at the percent change in birth rate by age between 2009 and 17. This is the age of the mother, and we've seen about a 75% decline in births for 15-year-olds. That is huge. That should be like a round of applause for the state of Colorado. As well as all of these other age groups in the teen. We've even seen it into the early 20s, which then that's the part that starts to make you a little concerned when you've got mid and upper 20s. But then we've seen an increase in birth rates for the young 30s. And one of the biggest drivers behind this decline in birth rates has been LARC, long-acting reversible contraceptives. That is what has made the biggest impact on decline in teen pregnancies in Colorado. Colorado has the #1 decline in teen births in the United States. So this is pretty impressive. And Pew Institute shows that if you can get someone to the age of 21, graduate from high school, just high school, have no babies, be employed, they've got a 98% chance of not ending up in poverty in their lifetime. That still gives me goosebumps when I say it. That is huge for Colorado, and that's huge for our population. So what has Denver been doing? So if we look at Denver over time, this is 1970. Between 1970 and about 1990, 1994, flat to declines in growth in Denver proper. Starting in about the mid-90s, we started seeing that increase. And if we remember back to the 90s here, we can see why. We started seeing growth in the entire state, so Denver was going to get part of that growth as well. Got a little flat in the early 2000s with that first bust, and then it's been increasing ever since. And if you look over time, you can see that really, when we talk about something unprecedented, it is the migration into Denver proper during the 2000s. Totally not like any of the historical components where there were decades of out-migration from Denver. It was the thing to do, and I'm a Denverite. I grew up here in Denver, and everybody's goal in my class was to move to Douglas County. Seriously, that was their goal. I want to go to Highlands Ranch, and I was like, oh man, I love Denver. But we can see how that's changed over time and where we've seen that increase in migration over the last decade. So why do people typically move? So if migration is important, and migration is important for a lot of times survival of communities, why do people migrate? Jobs. And all the time I talk about it is that if we look at job growth over time, we can see the correlation with migration. Jobs are the blue bars, migration is the red line. We can see this correlation as when we have stronger job growth, we have in migration because we need workers. And that's the part that a lot of time people confuse. They're like, oh man, I hate those people. And I'm like, oh, why do you hate people? I'm a demographer. We love people. And they're like, oh, they're on our roads, they're in our homes, they drive up to the mountains, they're on our ski slopes. And I'm like, all right, but what do you think about jobs? They're like, oh man, I love jobs. I'm like, now go with me on this. A job is a person. And a housing unit is where that job sleeps at night. So you've got to have one another together. They both come together. And so when we hear these challenges, when people are talking about, oh, I don't want any more migration, the conversation should be, what kind of economic development strategies are we creating within the state, and or how are we managing infrastructure and housing to make sure that you can have both together? So when we migrate people to Colorado, what kind of folks do we get? We get youngins. So if we look at the age distribution of our migrants to Colorado, this is age on the horizontal axis. We can see our bread and butter is kind of about 22 to 37. And a lot of them do bring their kiddos here. So we can see how that pattern is. Not a lot of folks over the age of like 40 really move into the state, although it is positive, and it's positive over the age of 60. So it's not where we're seeing an out-migration of the 60 plus or anything. This is Denver's migration by age. Just a little different. highly concentrated in the young. So we've got about 18 to 30 and out-migration for every other age group. And that is significant, and it makes sense in a way. About over half of the housing units in Denver proper are rental units. And so when people want to start families, maybe have a bigger lot, they move out of the city and they take their kiddos with them. And this has been the pattern over time, but this is really important to understand because that drives who is here. When we migrate people to Colorado, where do they come from? So the darkest colors, reds, are the largest donors. And our largest donors are California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, and Arizona. When we also lose people. People leave the state. I know that's a shocker, but we do have people that leave, and they go to California, Texas, Washington, Arizona, and Florida. So all we're really doing is trading people back and forth, right? On net, this last time, between 15 and 16, Illinois was the net largest donor, then New York, California, Virginia, and Florida. Biggest piece is that when we're looking at migration, our in-migration annually averages anywhere between 170 and 230,000 people a year in. Out, anywhere between 150 and 190,000 a year. So there's a lot of mobility. But we're actually ranked toward the bottom in mobility in the United States, if you can believe it. And they tend to be younger, lower income, higher educated than the US average. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait, that makes no sense. How can they be both higher education and lower income? The key factor, they are younger. How many of you think that somebody 25 probably makes less than somebody 45? Yes. Well, hopefully, right? I mean, it's not always across the spectrum, but as you age, you typically move up in your career and start making more money. So if we tend to attract younger adults, they tend to have lower incomes because they're starting out their career. If we look at Denver proper, where do they attract most of their people from? So the red, orange, yellow are donors. The blues are receivers. And so we can kind of see where definitely Denver donates a lot of people within the state, but you can also see where Denver loses to the rest of the U.S. and where we're getting a lot of in-migration even into Denver from Southern California, Arizona, Florida, and then the East Coast, upper East Coast. And North Dakota, apparently. I guess, who knows? So let's talk about race and ethnicity a little bit. Denver is growing a lot more diverse, and this is not just Denver proper, this is also Denver metro area and the state as a whole. If we look over time and we look at our race ethnic makeup in 1970, about 85% of the population in the state was 85% of the population was white non-Hispanic, with about 10% Hispanic and about 5% all other race ethnic groups. By 2010, we had increased our Hispanic population to about 10% or 20%. Our all other race ethnic groups about 10% almost, and then the white non-Hispanic about 70%. By 2040, we're forecasting, especially the Hispanic population, which is our largest minority population, to be about 33%. All other race ethnic groups about 12%, and the white non-Hispanic about 55%. And a lot of times people say, Elizabeth, how do you know that? And I will tell you that this is not rocket science whatsoever. If you know what your kiddos look like, all you have to do is age them. And it works really well. If you were 19 last year, pretty good odds you're 20 this year. And so we take everybody and we age them over time. And if we look at our youngins right now, in 2015, about 43% of our population under 18 was already either Black, Hispanic, Asian, or other minority share. By 2050, forecast to be about 58%. And I'm sorry when I expanded this slide, I didn't get these to line up perfectly. But you can see with age that race and ethnic share decline. So if we look at our 65 plus currently right now, only about 16%. And so that shows kind of that disparity by age on our race ethnic makeup, but that's why we're forecasting such an increase. Why does that matter? Well, in Denver, what we can see, if we look at all of Denver, we look at the Hispanic population is about 49%. I'm sorry. The white population is about 49% compared to the state as a whole at 68%. If we look at just the Hispanic share, a big difference in Denver, 35% versus 23%. And if we look at the kiddos in Denver, even more of a significant difference, already 53% Hispanic in Denver under 18. So we've got this huge increase in our race ethnic makeup, especially in Denver. And so we're seeing that change. The other piece that we know about, just again, looking at age and who enters the labor force just between 2015 and 2020, so this 5-year time frame, the net increase in our working population is about 70% Hispanic, about 65% Hispanic. So if you can see this in your head, the largest increase in our working age population, Hispanic, the largest growth in our population in our youngest ages, Hispanic. And Colorado still has the highest educational attainment gap in the nation between white non-Hispanic and Hispanic, about 30-point differential. A lot of that has to do with that our white population has got one of the highest educational attainments in the US, but our Hispanic population is about 24th in attainment. And so that differential is huge because we've got, which I'll go into in a second, a large aging of our population. A lot of people are going to be leaving the labor force. The largest entrants are going to be Hispanic. And they aren't as prepared as our previous generations of all total population. We're getting full, we're getting tight on population, right? There's a lot of people in the state. We don't want to have to migrate every new worker. But if we don't do something to balance attainment, we're going to have some challenges. So let's talk about age a little bit. We talk about age, and I think that that's probably the most important component for demographics in that it impacts everything that you do. Where you spend, how you spend, where you live, how much you're willing to pay, the services that you require, how you participate in the labor force, all changes by age. And if we look at Colorado's age distribution over here on the left-hand side, our median age is about 37. We can look at our different generations. We've got our silent generation in light blue, our baby boomers in the purple, our Gen X, our millennials, our post-millennials, which I did not come up with the name, and then we've got our next generation after that. Can you believe there's 2 generations past the millennials? Isn't that amazingly hard to believe? But you can see where we are, and a lot of people first look at this curve. They're like, oh my gosh, is that a death curve? And I'm like, no, why'd you get that idea? They're like, it just kind of looks like it. And I'm like, no. What it shows you is our migration pattern. Who do we migrate here? Youngins. And how long does it take a youngin to get older? About 30 to 40 years. So we brought our first big group of youngins in the 1970s. It's taken them 30 to 40 years to age. They just happened to be baby boomers. That was the generation that moved in the 70s. And so we can see that there's a lot of growth that we're seeing in the 65 plus, which is where the black line is, and definitely people behind. But I also want you to notice this slowdown behind. And so when we saw that starting slowdown in births in 2007, you can totally see it coming through the pipeline. And when they don't enter kindergarten, you know, we started getting calls from school districts saying, hey, where are the kids? And I was like, well, they weren't born. They're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, they weren't born, so that's why they're not in kindergarten. But guess what? A kindergartner then becomes a 5th grader, then becomes a middle schooler, then becomes a high schooler, and then becomes potentially an entrant into college and university. And so that is why it's important to keep an eye on these births and this trend. You might think, oh, well, that's only 5,000 difference, 10,000 difference between our peak and maybe where we are now, but it's slowing down every year after that in our forecast. And it also it's cumulative over time. So it's something we need to keep an eye on. So completely different than Colorado's age distribution is Denver's age distribution. We've got the silent generation, you've got boomers, but then you've got more Xers than boomers, and certainly a lot more millennials than Xers. And so you can see this, and then you can see that curve. A lot of this is really due to migration when they come in, but then you can kind of see where we're very low in the young population. And just to get a feel for what aging kind of feels like, this is our aging. This is 1990 in the dark red, and then in the orange, this is 2010. And so think of it vertically. And the black line is at 65. So between 1990 and 2010, there was very little growth in the 65 plus. There is a lot of growth in the 45 to 64-year-olds. Very little growth in kind of the 30s and the late 20s, and then some growth in those youngins. Between 2010 and 2030, where are we seeing growth? A lot of growth in the 65 plus. Very little growth in the 45 to 64-year-olds. Some growth here in the millennials and in that youngin population. Very little growth in basically the under 20. So tell me something about the 45 to 64-year-olds. Highest earning, highest spending, highest property tax paying. The golden goose, right? Especially for a public institution like this that's looking at taxpayer dollars. What goes into the system? Highest spending, highest earning, highest property tax paying. And that's what was growing a lot between 1990 and 2010. Is it growing now? No. Will this put more constraints on public finance? Yes. Until we get these guys, our millennials, over here. So what's the best way? We don't migrate 40-year-olds, right? We migrate youngins. So what do we need to do to make sure that we've got great 45-year-olds? We've got to attract and retain our youngins. Get them educated, get them jobs, get them housing so that they are productive, golden goose, at 45. And that's a horrible way to think about someone, but we have to be strategic, right, in the way that we think about our population and how we attract and retain and think about these things into the future. So if we look at Colorado's change in age just between 18 and 25, total state forecast increase by 11%. The under 17, only 2%. Those entering the labor force, 9%, so below. Prime working age, the 25 to 54-year-olds, right at about 12%. The older age workers, the kind of the 55 to 64, and it's flat, and that's because it's the Gen X is moving into that age group, and they were a smaller generation. They were first known as the baby bust, and then they got the cool name of Gen X. I don't know how those happen. Retirement age, 23%. Long-term care age, 22%. We're seeing a lot of pressure on this aging side with very little pressure, with very slow pressure on the young side. If we look at Denver, very similar. All ages forecast to increase by about 9%. Years 0 to 17, I cannot believe this. In Denver proper, we're forecasting declines in the 0 to 17-year-olds. Weird. We thought it was weird, not that weird because it was Boulder, but Boulder had a decline in under 18 between 2000 and 2010. And that was pretty easy to explain. Jefferson County also had a decline in the under 18 during that time frame. For Denver to see it, it's kind of unusual that we're going to start to see this decline in the under 18. We can see the 16 to 24 at about 9%, 25 to 54 about 8%, 55 to 64 11%, 65 to 74 25%. So we can see this pressure at that aging population. So just to kind of tie things up and move forward on the forecast, what we are forecasting for the state as a whole to increase between 2018 and 2050 by about 2.4 million people. What I say is just a lot more friends, right? 2.4 million people between 2018 and 2050. 2 million of that along the Front Range. So a lot of friends along the Front Range. 1 million in the Denver metro area. About 600,000 up north between Larimer and Weld. About 400 down south between El Paso and Pueblo, with the remaining 400,000 around the rest of the state. The grayed out counties, you ask. What's happening to them? Flat to declines. So we're forecasting about a third to almost a half of the counties declining in population. Yeah, that's kind of scary. So we have a challenge managing Denver, let's say, with all of the growth. Imagine trying to manage a community when you've got population decline. How do you fund schools? How do you fund roads and bridges? How do you fund daycare centers? How do you fund all public services when you've got a declining population? It's tough. Maybe that's our forecast, right? But this is just a forecast. Colorado's got the 5th highest median household income in the country. Do you think we're going to be able to attract and retain the best and the brightest when they could go to Texas? Now, granted, it'd be Texas, but they've got jobs there too, and housing is really affordable. So when a youngin' is really trying to make it, educate their kids, pay for housing, they're going to be looking at where can they do it. Colorado's got the 5th highest behind. California's 3rd. Boston is 4th. DC is 2nd. Oh, sorry, that, again, moving it over was a little challenging. First, where's first? Hawaii. And I forgot to clip them in. Sorry. I'm not trying to diss them whatsoever. But it is an impact on Colorado. So there's a lot of other risks. So housing is definitely one of the problems and challenges that Colorado's got. So maybe we won't grow as fast as we're forecasting. National growth, definitely, we don't know what's happening nationally in terms of an international immigration policy. That's got to get solved. That's got to get set to at least understand what our supply potentially will be on the international side. Water, climate, labor force, infrastructure are all challenges that Colorado faces. State budget, education, affordable options for everyone. Age, industry changes, natural disasters. Now that's the only positive. That's the only potential adder. The rest of these could be decliners in terms of pressure for the state, but natural disasters could be actually positive, because who are our 3 biggest donor states? Texas, California, Florida. Who's had some really bad natural disasters lately? All 3 of them. So could they end up being larger donors, looking for a safe state? Now, I will tell you that we're not the safest state. You know, we have fires and flooding too. Anybody, Ohio, come on. One Ohio, 2, 3. So Ohio, this could be their comeback. They have got supposedly this most climate neutral state in the US in terms of they don't really get a lot of tornadoes, flooding, or forest fires. So this could be it. This could be it for them. They've got to come up with some other stuff too, but so in total, just remember when you're looking at things within the university and maybe whatever classes you might teach or whatever you're involved with, that everything is connected. Really understanding this relationship between population, jobs, age, migration, labor is critical. And when we're looking at population and jobs and age and migration, labor, also remember that other pieces are part of that, like housing, like affordable daycare. Other pieces that make it possible for people to exist in a community. So we're definitely seeing continued growth. I mean, 2.4 million more people, 2 million on the Front Range, 1 million in the Denver metro area. That's going to be fun. How do we balance that? How do we manage that? So we're seeing definitely a slowing in births, but an increasing in deaths. But we've got this migration impact that is slower than we've seen in the past. Certainly a lot of impacts due to aging, impacting the labor force, income, industrial mix, housing and service demands. Big question is, how prepared are we for these risks? How prepared are we for a recession? Federal budget, China, water, industry transitions, infrastructure needs. There's a lot of challenges facing the state. So with that, I believe I'm done, except we've got this thing called Census 2020 coming up next year. I can't tell you how many calls I got a week ago, 2 weeks ago on April 1st saying, hey, I didn't get my form. And I'm like, Census 2020, right? Who's excited for 2020? Oh, we got 1, 2, 3. Oh, come on, let's all get on board. We've got somebody in your communications department is part working with CDHE on communication plan for higher ed in terms of what's going on. Big piece is to know that it is important for your funding. It is important for representation, and it is important for knowledge for you guys in terms of understanding what's going to be going on. This is the best source of data that we ever get. In terms of funding, about $2,300 per person per year in federal transfers to the state based on the census count. Huge. We miss one person, that's a lot of money because it's used for 10 years. The census will be different this decade. There'll be an online option as well as a phone-in option. So, and then the traditional mail will be there as well. Our ask of you guys is just become familiar with Census 2020, get excited about it, tell your friends and family about it. Let us know where you have questions or challenges or thoughts. Let us know how we can work with you. We've got a website that we've launched. You can just Google Census 2020 Colorado and it'll come up. But with that, I am now, I believe, completely done. Yep, because it goes back to the beginning. Any questions, comments? I don't know where I am on time, if I can answer any questions or not. Okay, I can, apparently. Any questions, comments, thoughts? No, the citizenship question has not been decided. It is going to the Supreme Court the 23rd of April. But there's been 3 federal courts that have heard it, and all 3 have come out against adding the citizenship question. So we should know by the 23rd, and then be able to hopefully move forward with some knowledge of what's going to be there. But that's a good question.
So that figure that showed the decrease in 0 to 17 in Denver, does that break down any, that's a pretty big age range, right, 0 to 17, does that break down any further than that? I mean, like, so we can know how long that decrease is going to happen? Like, are there lots of little babies coming, or is it, you know, even fewer little babies?
So what I can do is I can give you my card, and anybody's played on our website at all? No one? Oh, so sad. So we have a really cool website, but don't play on it when you've got work to do, because you will get on there and you will get stuck playing. So we have single year of age forecasts for every county from 1990 through 2050. So you'll be able to look at any age that you're interested in and looking in at any time frame that you can pull it from. So I'm totally willing to share, and they've already got it. So they can, I don't know, they're magic, but they can certainly do that. And if it's not easy on the school's end to do it, I'm more than happy to share it with people.
And then my second question is, I know that they were testing alternative examples of or alternative options for the race and ethnicity question to make it more accurate. And I believe the current administration has decided that is not going to move forward, like, because the idea was to better identify within the Hispanic population. It's problematic in the way that's collected now, but at this point it's the old way, right?
So actually, the question was about the race ethnic question on the census form. So they did a lot of testing. They have changed the order of the Hispanic question. So that may be then more clear this decade. The thing that I thought you were going to also ask about is that they were doing another test on the, it was called MENA, Middle Eastern North African. And that did get left off because the testing wasn't complete enough. I was really bummed because I thought that that would have been really helpful, but it did not get included. But maybe we can hope for next decade.
So they're changing the order so it's not the Hispanic origin and then the race question?
They are almost simultaneous to where you can see, and lots of options in terms of trying to clarify, because what ended up happening is that they would see the race question first. Let's say that maybe they would choose Hispanic, and then they would hit the ethnicity question first, and they'd hit Hispanic. Then they go over to race and put other, because there was no race maybe that they felt comfortable with. So what they're trying to do is get a better clarity so that it's not just all in other, that it's more clear. And I didn't bring it. I should have brought that slide. I have that slide. I'll give you my contact information. We can talk more. The gentleman behind you.
Yeah, I know you touched a little bit on the education or the attainment gap in Colorado and between whites and the largest group, Hispanic students, or Hispanic people, I should say. And so I was kind of curious, I know in the past we've imported a lot of people with degrees from other states, and that you said something about the white population having a very high level of educational attainment. So from 2018 to 2050, where you said we're going to have predicting 2.4 million migration into the state, are you seeing or are you thinking that that's going to be people who are coming in with degrees already, or do we have any sense of that at this point?
So it's interesting with migration theory and just migration data that when we see that import, when we see that in migration, they do tend to have a lot of them have higher ed, have a higher degree, whether it's certificate, associates, or plus. But it makes sense because typically the higher educational attainment, the more opportunities you've got, the reason to move. Where, like, let's say you have less than a high school degree, the likelihood that you're gonna get up, pack, and move to Denver is limited just because of the cost, and your opportunities aren't as great. So that is the case, that we are forecasting that most of them would come in. If we can, and the big question is if we can attract and retain. A lot of our migration that we're forecasting is because of the job demand, actually from people leaving the labor force. So I'm gonna age, I'm gonna leave my job, I'm gonna need a new person to take my position. That doesn't show up anywhere in new jobs. When we look at new jobs that are released, it's an old job, old person, old job. There's going to be more of a demand from leavers from the labor force. There's going to be over 1 million people leaving the labor force over the next 20 years, all of the boomers, plus a lot of the Xers. And we've got limited people coming into that supply, so that would mean more migrants to fill positions, not just from leavers, but also any of those new jobs.
Do you have any information on what those jobs are? Are they going to lose 1 million? Are they all in certain industries?
So the question is, do we know what jobs those are that they're leaving from? Yeah, we have a really good idea by industry, the average age. And so this, I don't have the deck here, but I can certainly give you a lot of that information. But our oldest aged industries are mining, utilities, education, and healthcare. And truck drivers. So that is one of the reasons why they're looking at that industry so much in terms of automation, because they can't find enough workers. It's one of the oldest industries and has one of the highest requirements in terms of testing to get into, and so they're not finding any qualified folks. It's really weird. And just stop me whenever I'm supposed to stop in terms of questions.
I had a question about the forecasting model itself. For the aging piece, you said it's not rocket science, that we're just kind of aging people over time. horizon?
Great, good question. So we use two models to do our forecast. We do a cohort component model, and that's really that aging piece. So we take everybody, age them through time, apply their birth and death rates by age, race, and ethnicity, and that ends up being that supply of people. Then we run an economic model. And so we get a national model from Moody's.com, and then we see where Colorado fits into that picture. And if, for example, let's say they're growing healthcare at X, we look at Colorado's share of healthcare and we grow it in relation to what that national forecast is. So we run this economic model, again, out to 2050, 2048 right now. And you can imagine any economists out there doing an economic model out to 2050. Yeah, you're like lucky to make next year, right? So we take those two pieces. We take the economic forecast, that's our demand for workers. Then we look at the population supply created by the cohort component model. That's our supply of workers. Where we don't have enough workers, we then in-migrate. Where we have too many workers or too many people, we out-migrate, and that's how we bring the two pieces of the model together. So it's running two models and then kind of merging them together to come up with an informative answer. And what's nice with it is then it's done by county, by single year, by industry. And then we meet with the counties to say, does this make sense? And so it's really helpful because whether they've got plans, like they've run out of water. So like Arapahoe County gave us a turn off switch last year. They said, yeah, no, we're out of water. So we can't have that many people. You need to tamper it down. Denver gave us a number saying, no, we don't have enough space for any more housing. So they gave us a build out number. Adams then took everybody else. Bless Adams. So that's kind of how we do this work, is really trying to make it no black box at all, very informed and very participatory. We've got paperwork on it on our website if you'd like to look at the methods in more detail.
Oh, I have one follow-up question, and you've already kind of spoken to it, but just in terms of a strategy for us as an institution, it seems to me that the achievement gap is where we've been focused and where we should focus even harder, and conversations with the county, with the city, do they express thanks or hope at all with respect to universities and what we might do to close the achievement gap and therefore help with the shortage of possible skilled work in the future?
I think that it's a really good question. I know that, oh, yep, sorry. So the question was, how are counties and local governments and state agencies working potentially with higher ed to look at this achievement gap that exists? And as we're looking at strategies for MSU, where does it fit in to the future and the forecast? And did I kind of get that right? Okay. One, I think I applaud the fact that, and I'm going to get it completely wrong, you are a Hispanic something. Thank you. That is huge. And it's probably one of the best things that you've got going out there. Because that's the fastest growth for our kiddos are Hispanic. And I think if more and more people see people like themselves in places, that creates more and more attraction. I think that finally county, local governments and state agencies are looking at higher ed. The people that you need to bring in more are industry. Industry needs to be at the table more in these conversations of creating a qualified workforce and labor force. And I think they maybe got a little lazy over time, thinking that the states and the universities would do it all for them. And then there became such a huge disconnect between what the firms wanted and what the universities or schools were preparing, that then there was this disconnect. So I would create more opportunities for firms, for business to be part of the discussion, and I would really work with, the state's done a nice job bringing workforce and Department of Labor and higher ed all together is making sure on that higher ed piece that you guys have a really big voice with higher ed in that discussion as well. But a lot of people are trying to say, oh, you don't need a degree. And I'm like, yes, you do. I would say you need a degree if you want a degree and you can afford a degree and you have the capacity to do that. Should you push everybody toward a degree? Maybe not, but certainly don't dissuade anyone that's got that on their mind. Don't get them thinking, oh, I don't need it. If you look at earnings between degree and non-degree, the gap is, and I should have brought that slide, the gap is widening over time. So anytime somebody says, oh, you don't need, I'm like, all you're telling people is you're going to get less money. And that's awful to be telling somebody. Only a third of the population, natives, have a college degree. You've got 2/3 of the state to work on. So even though we've got this slowdown in the youngins, there's still a lot of people not getting a college degree. So I think that you've got capacity on both ends that there's still folks out there. All right, thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much for coming. For strategic planning team members, if you want to meet with Prasanna or have any questions about the process, we're going to be in 400, just down the hall, SSB 400. Hope to see you there. Thank you again to Elizabeth Garner. What a fascinating conversation.